There's a practice that advanced Tibetan Buddhist monks have developed over centuries that I keep returning to. It's called Tummo. The word translates roughly to inner fire. And what it describes is something that most of us have been told in various ways is simply not possible. The ability to consciously influence the autonomous systems of the body. The parts that are supposed to run on their own. Heart rate, body temperature, the deep physiological machinery that hums along beneath the threshold of willed control. Through specific combinations of breathing technique, visualization, sustained concentration, and precise body posture, certain practitioners have demonstrated measurable physiological changes that shouldn't, by conventional understanding, be achievable through thought alone. Monks meditating in freezing temperatures, generating enough internal heat to dry wet sheets draped across their shoulders. The body responding to the mind in ways that challenge the boundary between voluntary and involuntary. I find this genuinely fascinating, not as mysticism, but as a question about what the mind is actually capable of when it's developed with sufficient discipline and directed with sufficient precision. What Tummo seems to work with at its foundation is attention, the deliberate direction of concentrated awareness towards specific internal processes combined with visualization and breath appears to create conditions the body responds to as if those conditions were physically real. The inner fire isn't metaphorical, the warmth is measurable, which means the visualization, in some meaningful sense, became physiological. This opens a question I've been sitting with for a while. If the boundary between the mental and the physical is more permeable than we're taught, what else might be available? Not as wishful thinking, but as a serious inquiry. How much of what we experience as fixed, our baseline energy, our nervous system's default state, our physical recovery, even our pain thresholds, is actually more responsive to trained attention than we've assumed? I'm in the early stages of exploring this personally, and I want to be honest about that. This is a seed being planted, not a result being reported. The practice is demanding, the learning curve is real, but what draws me in is exactly that it asks something I find deeply compelling. What happens when you take the same discipline we've been talking about throughout these segments, the pause, the compound effect, the trained attention, and turn it all the way inward toward the body itself, toward the breath, toward the nervous system, toward the places where thought and physiology are less separate than they appear? There's a line of thinking across many traditions and increasingly in contemporary science that the mind and body are not two systems running in parallel, but one system talking to itself in different languages. Tummo, at its most practical, might just be learning to speak both languages at once, to give the body instructions it can receive and act on through channels that most of us never learn to use. This is where the inner work gets interesting to me, where the philosophy and the physiologies start to overlap, where sitting with yourself quietly enough, for long enough, with enough precision, starts to produce changes not just in how you think, but in what your body does. So I'll leave this here as an open door rather than a conclusion, and I'm curious, if you believed you had more influence over your own physiological state than you currently use, what would you want to learn to change first? The brain doesn't always distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is actually happening. That sentence sounds like something out of a self-help book, which is part of why it tends to get dismissed. But the research behind it is serious, and the implications, if you actually follow them through, are worth sitting with carefully. There's a study that has stayed with me. Researchers asked one group of people to physically practice playing a sequence of notes for 5 days. A second group was asked to only imagine playing the same sequence with the same intensity of focus, the same duration, but no physical contact with the keys.
The neural changes in the motor cortex were nearly identical between the two groups. The brain that had only imagined playing had reorganized itself almost as thoroughly as the brain that had actually played. What this suggests is something remarkable. Visualization, when it's specific enough, sustained enough, and emotionally engaged enough, isn't just mental preparation for the real thing. In a meaningful neurological sense, it is the real thing. The body responds, the brain adapts, the rehearsal leaves a physical trace. Elite athletes have known this intuitively for a long time. The sprinter who runs the race in full detail before the starting gun, the diver who executes every rotation in stillness before climbing the platform, the surgeon who walks through the procedure in their mind before making the first incision. This isn't superstition, it's applied neuroscience. What I find most interesting is how much of this is available to ordinary life, to the kind of inner work that doesn't involve athletic performance or surgical precision. The conversation you're dreading, rehearsed not to script it, but to feel your way through the emotional terrain before you're in it. The version of yourself you're trying to become, visualized not as a fantasy, but as a real, present, physiologically detailed experience. How does that person stand? What does that person's nervous system feel like? What decisions do they make naturally, automatically, because they've already made them 1,000 times in the mind? This is where visualization connects to everything else we've been exploring. The Tummo practitioner uses visualization to generate physical heat. The athlete uses it to wire in performance. The person doing inner work can use it to install the future self more deeply, to make the qualities they're reaching for feel familiar rather than aspirational. The practice I've been developing is specific, not vague positive thinking, detailed, sensory, emotionally present imagery, the scene rendered in full, the light, the temperature, the feeling in the body, the quality of attention in the mind. The more specific the visualization, the more the nervous system treats it as real, and the more the nervous system treats it as real, the more the behavior that follows begins to match it. There's a version of this that becomes almost architectural. You're not just imagining a future, you're constructing the neural infrastructure for it ahead of its arrival, building the road before the journey begins, so that when you get there, something in you already knows the way. So I'm curious, if you were to visualize the most specific, embodied version of who you're becoming, not a vague better self, but a real, present, physiologically detailed version, what would that person be doing differently right now, today, in the ordinary hours?
For most of my life, I was proud of not believing. I had grown up inside a set of inherited beliefs, passed down through generations, woven into culture and tradition and family identity, and somewhere in childhood I looked at all of it and decided, quietly and firmly, that I couldn't go along with it. It didn't make sense to me. The logic didn't hold. The stories had too many seams. And so I stepped away, and stayed away, for a long time. For decades, I occupied the position of the non-believer, the one who saw clearly, I thought, what others were consoling themselves with. I could point to the inconsistencies, trace the historical origins, explain away the comfort. And I wasn't wrong about any of the specific things I questioned, but I was missing something larger. It took a long time to see it. The realization, when it finally arrived, was something like this. My disbelief was itself a belief. I had chosen to believe that nothing follows this life, that consciousness ends, that the story closes, that whatever we are dissolves back into whatever we came from. I held that position with the same certainty that the believers I'd spent years disagreeing with held theirs. And the honest truth is, neither of us knows. We simply don't know the meaning of life.
We don't know what, if anything, follows it. We don't know whether consciousness is a temporary accident or something with more continuity than we can currently measure. These are genuinely open questions. Not open in the sense that any answer is equally supported by evidence, but open in the deeper sense that the evidence we have doesn't close them. And once I accepted that, once I really let it in, something shifted. Because I realized that the position I'd been holding wasn't arrived at through superior knowledge. It was also a choice. I had chosen to believe in the bleak version, and I had dressed that choice up as rationality for so long that I'd stopped noticing I was wearing a costume. Then one day I found myself thinking, isn't that kind of boring? To look at the genuinely open question of what this all means, this strange, brief, vivid experience of being alive, and default to the most colorless answer available? Maybe it's true. Maybe the lights go out and that's the end of it. But I don't actually know that. And if I don't know it, then I'm choosing it. And I'm allowed to choose differently. This isn't about converting to anything. It's about recognizing that meaning is something we participate in constructing, not something we passively receive or reject based on what we can prove. The question isn't which belief is true. It's which belief is worth living inside, which one opens the world rather than closing it, which one makes this brief, strange experience of being alive feel more worth inhabiting. I haven't landed anywhere definitive. I'm still somewhere in the middle, moving slowly, looking more carefully than I used to. But I've stopped treating certainty as the goal. The goal, I think, is a relationship with the mystery that doesn't flatten it, one that leaves room for wonder. So I'm curious, when you examine the beliefs you hold most firmly about what this life means and what follows it, how much of what you believe is what you actually know? And how much is simply what you've chosen, perhaps without realizing you were choosing?
There's a state I keep trying to find my way back to. It doesn't have a complicated name. Wonder. I don't mean the mild, pleasant surprise of something unexpected. I mean the deeper version, the one that stops you mid-thought and reminds you with physical force that existence is genuinely strange, that you are a conscious thing moving through an incomprehensibly vast universe on a rock that somehow produced life, somehow produced minds capable of asking why. That the fact of any of this is not obvious, that it is, when you really let it in, extraordinary. Children live closer to this state than adults do, not because they're smarter or more sensitive, but because everything is still new enough to register as remarkable. The adult mind has processed most of what it encounters into categories, seen it, filed it, moved on. Efficiency over presence. But wonder doesn't survive filing. It requires something closer to looking at a familiar thing as if you've never seen it before and genuinely meaning it. I've been thinking about what actually produces this state, because I don't think wonder is something that just happens to you, or at least it doesn't stay available if you only wait for it to arrive. It can be cultivated, deliberately, quietly, through habits of attention that keep the world from going entirely stale. One practice I keep returning to is scale, deliberately placing myself in imagination at the extremes of size, going all the way down into the cell, into the molecule, into the atom, into the strange probabilistic fog that physics describes at the subatomic level, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, and then all the way up, out past the atmosphere, past the solar system, past the galaxy, into the vast darkness where our entire Milky Way is one small smear of light among hundreds of billions. At both extremes, something happens. The ordinary scale of daily concern becomes briefly transparent, and underneath it, or around it, something wider and stranger comes into view. Another practice is what I'd call deliberate naivety.
asking the questions a child would ask about things I've stopped asking questions about. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? What actually is consciousness? What does it mean that time moves in one direction? These aren't questions with clean answers, but sitting with them, really sitting with them, rather than dismissing them as unanswerable, produces something. A loosening of the certainty that the world is ordinary, a reminder that the explanations we have are not the same as understanding what anything actually is. Wonder, I've come to think, is a form of attention, a way of meeting the world that refuses to let it fully domesticate into the known. It's adjacent to the state of the open question we talked about last time, the willingness to live with mystery rather than immediately resolving it into something manageable. And what it produces in a life is something difficult to quantify but easy to feel, a quality of aliveness, a sense that the world is larger than the version of it you've been carrying around, that there is always more, always something else, something stranger, something worth paying closer attention to just beyond the edge of what you've already mapped. So, here's what I keep returning to. When did you last feel genuine wonder? Not mild interest, but the kind that made existence feel briefly, unmistakably strange and beautiful. And what was it that finally broke through the ordinary?
I have a word for it. My own word. Negatra. It translates simply to negativity, but giving it a name of my own making does something. It makes the thing more specific, more visible, more like something I can actually work with rather than just be subject to. Here's what I keep coming back to about the force of negativity. It isn't an aberration. It's structural. Reality itself is built on the contrast between positive and negative, from the charged particles inside every atom all the way up to the level of consciousness and mood and perception. The negative pole isn't a malfunction in the system. It's half the system. When I think about the scale of it in the physical universe, the fact that the vast majority of space is dark, empty, cold, the distances between stars and galaxies are incomprehensibly large. The bright spots, the luminous things, are actually the exception. Light is rare. Darkness is the default. And I find something clarifying in that, rather than dispiriting, because it means that navigating toward the bright spots requires knowing where the darkness is. On the level of inner life, Negatra manifests in forms most of us are familiar with. Sadness that arrives without obvious cause, worry that loops without resolution, the heaviness of laziness, which is its own form of negative energy, less dramatic than despair but just as effective at pulling you off course. These forces are real. They exert genuine pressure on perception, on decision-making, on the quality of any given day. What I've learned is that the worst thing I can do with Negatra is pretend it isn't there. The second worst thing is to be consumed by naming it. What actually works is something more deliberate, a kind of ongoing inventory. I keep a curated list, not as an act of rumination, but as an act of awareness. The specific negative forces that tend to recur in my life, the patterns I've learned to recognize, the early signals of a particular form of Negatra arriving before it's fully assembled. Because here's what I've found. Caught early, most of these forces are manageable. It's when they go unnoticed, when they operate below the threshold of conscious attention for days or weeks, that they do the most damage. The shadow grows largest when you're not looking at it. There's something almost like hygiene in this practice. The way you maintain physical health through regular attention to the body, you maintain inner health through regular attention to what's accumulating in the emotional and psychological space. Not obsessively, just consistently enough that nothing gets to grow unchecked. I also try to hold Negatra without moral weight. The dark emotions aren't evidence of failure. They're part of being alive in a reality that is genuinely built on contrast. Sadness exists because joy does. Worry exists because things actually matter. Even laziness, looked at carefully, is often just exhaustion in disguise, the system signaling that something needs to rest. The negative forces aren't always what they appear, but they always deserve attention.
The shadow behind every figure standing in the sunlight isn't trying to swallow the light. It's just the inevitable consequence of the light being real. So I'm curious, when you think about the specific forms of Nagatra that tend to recur in your own life, are there ones you've learned to recognize early, and ones that still manage to catch you off guard before you've noticed them building?
We spend a lot of energy trying to feel better, and that's understandable. Difficult emotions are uncomfortable, sometimes genuinely painful, and the impulse to move away from them as quickly as possible is one of the most natural things in the world. But I've started to wonder what we lose in that rush toward relief. What gets bypassed? What goes unsaid? Because I've noticed in my own interior life that the dark emotions are rarely random. They arrive with a kind of insistence that suggests they have a reason for being there. And when I've been willing to slow down enough to actually listen, to treat the difficult feeling as a message rather than a malfunction, what I find underneath is almost always something worth knowing. Take sadness. When I examine it closely, the sadness I feel is almost never about nothing. It's usually a signal that something I value is being threatened, absent, or grieved. The very presence of the sadness is evidence of care. You can't grieve something you don't love. You can't miss something that never mattered. The sadness is painful precisely because the thing it's pointing at is real and important, which means the sadness isn't the enemy, it's the information. Worry operates similarly. At its worst, worry's a loop, repetitive, circular, consuming energy without producing clarity. But underneath the loop, if you can get below it, there's almost always a specific fear about a specific thing that actually matters. Something the worried mind is trying to protect. The worry is loud and inefficient, but the concern driving it is usually legitimate. The question isn't how to silence it. It's how to hear what it's actually trying to say, and then decide what, if anything, to do about it. Even laziness, which I've always thought of as one of the more shapeless and uninformative dark emotions, has started to reveal something when I sit with it. It's rarely pure laziness. More often, it's exhaustion that hasn't been acknowledged, or a quiet resistance to something that isn't actually aligned with what I genuinely want, or the body's way of saying that the pace of recent weeks has been extractive rather than sustainable. The laziness is asking for something, usually rest, sometimes recalibration, occasionally permission to stop doing something that was never really mine to do. What changes when you start treating dark emotions as messengers is the relationship itself. Instead of a dynamic where you're constantly trying to outrun or suppress what arises, you develop something closer to a working dialogue with your own interior. The feeling comes, you pause, that gap we've been talking about throughout these segments, and you ask, what are you here about? What is this actually telling me? The answer isn't always comfortable. Sometimes the message is something you'd rather not hear. A truth about a relationship, a direction, a version of yourself you've been maintaining that doesn't fit anymore. But uncomfortable truths received are more useful than comfortable silences. And the emotions that carry them, however dark, are doing you the service of not letting you look away. So I'm curious, when you think about a difficult emotion you've been trying to move past recently, what do you think it might actually be trying to tell you? And what would change if you spent 5 minutes listening to it instead of managing it?
There's a kind of courage that never makes it into the stories we tell about brave people. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. No one sees it happen. No moment of physical danger, no visible risk, no audience. It's the courage to feel something fully, to let a difficult emotion arrive and stay and move through you completely, rather than intercepting it at the door and redirecting it somewhere safer. I've come to think this is genuinely one of the harder things a person can do, because everything in us is organized in some way around not doing it. We have strategies so sophisticated and so automatic that we often don't recognize them as avoidance at all. We get busy, we analyze, we reframe and reinterpret, we help other people with their problems, we make plans. All of it real, all of it productive looking, all of it sometimes serving the quiet function of keeping us from having to sit in the room with what's actually happening. What I've noticed is that the emotions we avoid most successfully are usually the ones that have the most to tell us. The feeling we've been redirecting for years, sometimes decades, tends to be the one that, when finally faced, contains the most important information about who we are and what we actually need. Emotional courage isn't about performing suffering. It's closer to a willingness to be honest with yourself about your interior reality, to stop narrating it, explaining it, fixing it, or transcending it long enough to simply inhabit it. To be in the feeling rather than thinking about it from a careful distance. The difference between those two things is significant and physically felt. Thinking about grief from a distance is an entirely different experience than letting grief be present in the body. Observing anxiety from behind glass is different from letting the anxiety land without immediately problem-solving it. The managed version is safer. The inhabited version is where the actual movement happens. What emotional courage produces, and this is the thing that keeps me returning to the practice even when it's uncomfortable, is a kind of aliveness that managed emotion never delivers. When you let something fully in, really in, you come out the other side more present, more yourself, as if something that had been held at arm's length for a long time finally got to complete its arc, and in completing it, freed up something that was being used to hold it at bay. There's also a relational dimension worth naming. The most genuine connections I've had with other people have happened in moments of emotional honesty, mine or theirs. Not in the moments of competence or presentation, but in the moments of unmanaged reality, where the feeling was visible rather than curated, where someone was having their actual experience rather than a performed version of it. That kind of honesty requires courage, the specific courage of being seen in a real state rather than a managed one, of trusting that the unfiltered version of what you're feeling won't be more than the relationship or you can hold. So, I'm curious. Is there an emotion you've been managing from a distance for a long time? Something you've been careful not to fully feel? And what do you think would happen if you finally let it arrive completely?
Dopamine, the reward chemical. I find myself returning to this word, this concept, more than almost any other when I'm trying to understand what's actually happening inside me on the days when things flow and on the days when they don't. There's something clarifying about bringing conscious awareness to an invisible thing that is nonetheless completely real, a chemical, a signal, a tiny molecular event in the brain that somehow carries the full weight of motivation, pleasure, direction. For me, motivation has always been complicated, and I think I understand why now. The mind I have, the way I tend to process possibility, means I can see a lot of directions at once, a lot of configurations, a lot of versions of what something could become. And while that has its advantages, it also creates a particular kind of paralysis, the maze of ideals. Too many paths, each one lit up, each one plausible, and the result is that instead of going down any of them, I stand at the center and spin. Motivation doesn't collapse because nothing matters. It collapses because everything seems to matter equally, and the signal gets lost in the noise. But here's what I've found my way back to again and again. Dopamine knows. Not in a mystical sense, but in a very literal, biological one. If I can actually slow down and bring my attention to what genuinely produces that feeling of reward in my body, not what I think should produce it, not what looks good on a list of goals, but what actually creates that real physical sensation of rightness, that's information. That's a compass. The practice I keep coming back to is almost embarrassingly simple. I sit with it, I try to honestly feel it, and I follow whatever lights up. Some of the signals come from unexpected places. A salad, for instance. I know that sounds minor, but it genuinely isn't. The specific, almost immediate sense of reward that comes after eating something clean and nutrient-dense is real enough that I can feel my brain responding to it. Not a metaphor, an actual shift in state. The body sending a clear message, that was good, do that again. Music does it differently. Playing an instrument brings a particular quality of dopamine, slower to arrive but deeper when it does. The reward that comes from making something with your hands, from finding a phrase that works, from the repetition of practice finally landing somewhere new. Listening works too, though differently again. Music heard versus music made, both real, both useful, both capable of unlocking something in me that the rest of the day had closed down. What I've learned is that the specific method matters less than the sustainability of it. A dopamine source you can return to reliably that doesn't leave you depleted or chasing more is one of the more valuable things you can identify about yourself. Because once that baseline is established, everything else becomes more available. The focus, the willingness to choose a direction and commit to it, the tolerance for not knowing exactly where the path leads. The dopamine doesn't solve the maze, but it makes you less afraid of being in it. So I'm curious, when you think about the moments in your daily life that produce that genuine, quiet sense of reward, the ones your body recognizes before your mind has a chance to second guess them, are you actually following those signals, or are you mostly explaining to yourself why you should want something different?
There's a version of starting that most people skip. They sit down to do the thing, the creative work, the focused task, the project that actually matters, and they expect the state to just be there, waiting for them, ready, available, like a light switch. But when it isn't, they interpret that as a problem with themselves. Writer's block, lack of motivation, something broken in the mechanism. But I've started to think about it differently. The state you need for good work doesn't precede the ritual, it follows it. A musician knows this intuitively. You don't walk cold onto a stage and expect the performance to arrive fully formed. You warm up. You play scales that aren't music yet. You let the fingers remember what the mind is still waking up to. The warm-up isn't the work, but without it, the work doesn't come. I think the same architecture applies to almost anything that requires real presence. What I've found, and this took longer to figure out than I probably should have, is that the warm-up is really just a deliberate dopamine sequence. A short series of things that reliably produce that sense of reward, of aliveness, of the brain coming online. Not manufactured enthusiasm, not a productivity hack, just the honest use of what you already know makes you feel good. For me, it might be the right music at the right volume, or a meal that my body actually thanks me for, something that sends back a clear signal of having been genuinely nourished, or a short walk where I'm not trying to think about anything in particular, and the thinking happens anyway, in that sideways, unclenched way it does when you stop demanding it. None of these are the work, but each one is a door, and the secret is that they don't have to be long. The ritual doesn't need to be elaborate to be effective. 5 minutes of the right music can shift the entire interior climate of the next 2 hours. A single good meal can change the quality of everything that follows it in a day. The leverage is real, and it's available. What I've also noticed is that the ritual creates a kind of Pavlovian signal over time. The more consistently you use the same on-ramp, the more reliably it delivers you to the same destination. The brain starts to recognize the sequence. Music on, that means we're going somewhere. Salad eaten, that means something good is about to happen. The body learns the pattern before the conscious mind has finished its coffee. The reason most people don't do this isn't laziness. It's that the ritual feels indulgent, unnecessary, like a delay of the real thing. But that framing has it backwards.
The ritual isn't the delay. Sitting down cold and staring at a blank page for 40 minutes waiting for a state that was never going to arrive that way, that's the delay. So I've started treating the warm-up as non-negotiable, not precious, not lengthy, just present. A small ceremony at the threshold between ordinary time and the kind of time where real work gets made. And here's what I keep wondering. If you already know the 2 or 3 things that reliably shift your state into something more alive and open, what would change if you stopped treating them as rewards for after the work and started using them as the door to get in?